My family always considered me a failure because I worked at the landfill. One time, my father even said, if you don't change your job by the end of the year, don't come back here anymore. But now, I have more money than they've ever seen. Let me back up and explain how I got to this point. Because trust me, 3 years ago I never imagined my life would take this crazy turn. So there I was, 28 years old, working at the municipal landfill in our town of about 40,000 people. Not exactly the career path my parents had in mind when they spent their life savings on my college education. But hey, life happens, right? The economy tanked right after I graduated. My degree in business administration wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and I had student loans breathing down my neck like a rabid dog. The landfill job wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent money. $15 an hour plus overtime, which was way better than the minimum wage gigs I'd been bouncing between. The work was exactly what you'd expect. Sorting through mountains of garbage, operating heavy machinery, dealing with smells that would make a skunk run for cover. Every Monday, like clockwork, my family would gather at my parents' house for dinner. These weekly get-togethers were supposed to be about family bonding, but they always turned into roast sessions with me as the main course. My brother Jake would roll up in his shiny Lexus RX. He was a real estate agent who caught the housing boom just right, and the jokes would start flying before I even made it to the front door. Jake had this way of making everything sound like friendly ribbing, but there was always an edge to it. He'd pat me on the shoulder and ask how my day of treasure hunting went, or whether I'd found any good leftovers for lunch. Mom would laugh, but it was one of those uncomfortable laughs that made everyone feel awkward. Dad would just shake his head and mutter something about wasted potential. The worst part was how they'd talk about me when they thought I couldn't hear. I'd be in the kitchen helping Mom with dishes, and I'd catch snippets of conversation from the living room. Dad telling Jake how disappointed he was, how he'd raised 2 sons, and only one of them had turned out successful. Mom wondering where she'd gone wrong, whether she'd been too soft on me as a kid. It got to the point where I dreaded those Monday dinners more than I dreaded going to work. At least at the landfill, people treated me with basic respect. My co-workers were good folks, blue-collar guys who understood that honest work was honest work, regardless of what you were shoveling. We'd joke around, help each other out when a job got tough, and nobody made you feel less than human for earning your paycheck with your hands instead of your mouth. But my family, they made it clear that they saw my job as a reflection of my character. Like somehow choosing to work with garbage meant I was garbage myself. The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd happily eat the food I bought with my dirty money, but they'd never acknowledged that I was contributing to the household or helping out financially when times got tough. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner last year. We were all sitting around the table, extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, and my cousin Sarah was going on about her new job at a marketing firm downtown. Everyone was congratulating her, talking about how proud they were, asking about her benefits and career prospects. Then my Uncle Bill, who'd had a few too many beers, decided it was time to roast me in front of everyone. He started going on about how, when he was my age, he would never have settled for such a dead-end job. How young people these days don't have any ambition or drive. How embarrassing it must be for my parents to tell their friends what their son does for a living. The whole table went quiet, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. My face was burning with embarrassment and anger, but I just sat there and took it like I always did. That's when Dad decided to pile on. He looked me straight in the eye and said those words that still ring in my ears. If you don't change your job by the end of the year, don't come back here anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom tried to smooth things over, saying he didn't mean it, but the damage was done. I finished my dinner in silence, made some excuse about needing to get home, and left. Driving home that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to quit my job. I needed the money, and honestly, I didn't hate the work itself. But I was going to prove them all wrong somehow. I just didn't know how yet. Little did I know that the universe was about to hand me the opportunity of a lifetime, wrapped up in the most unlikely package imaginable. The next few weeks at work were strange. I found myself looking at everything differently, wondering if there was something I was missing. My co-workers noticed I was quieter than usual, more focused on the job. Big Mike, our crew leader, asked if everything was okay at home. I just told him I had some family stuff to work through. Winter was setting in, and the work was getting harder. Frozen garbage is somehow even worse than regular garbage. Everything stuck together. The machinery doesn't work as well in the cold, and the smell seems to linger even longer. But I pushed through it, working overtime whenever I could get it, saving every penny I could manage. I started doing something I'd never done before, really paying attention to what people were throwing away. You'd be amazed at the stuff that ends up in landfills. Perfectly good furniture, electronics that just need a simple repair, clothes with tags still on them. Americans are incredibly wasteful, and working at the dump gave me a front row seat to that reality. One day in early December, I was sorting through a load of household items that had come in from one of the wealthier neighborhoods. Someone had clearly cleaned out an entire house, probably in estate sale, or something where they just wanted to get rid of everything quickly. There were boxes of books, old photo albums, furniture that looked like antiques, and random knickknacks scattered throughout. Most of it was going straight to the general waste pile, but I always separated out anything metal for the scrap heap. We got a few cents per pound for scrap metal, and the landfill let us workers take a small cut if we did extra sorting on our own time. It wasn't much, but every little bit helped. That's when my life changed forever, though I didn't know it at the time. I was loading a wheelbarrow with random pieces of metal, old pots, broken tools, decorative items, when something caught my eye. At the bottom of one of the boxes was this weird-looking statue thing. It was covered in dirt and grime, blackened like it had been a fire or something, but it was definitely bronze underneath. The thing looked almost human, but stretched out and thin, like someone had taken a person and pulled them through a pasta machine. It was ugly as sin, to be honest, but something about it made me stop and take a closer look. There was something written on the base in what looked like French, but I couldn't make out the words through all the crud. Now, normally I would have just tossed it in the scrap pile with everything else. Bronze is bronze, right? But something told me to hold on to it. Maybe it was just stubbornness, after all the crap my family had given me about being a garbage man. Maybe I wanted to prove that I could find treasure in the trash. Or maybe it was just curiosity about what was written on the bottom. Whatever the reason, I decided to take it home. I figured I could clean it up and put it on my windowsill as a conversation piece. At the very least, it would give me something to do with my evenings besides watching TV and feeling sorry for myself. That night, I brought the statue home to my tiny one-bedroom apartment. The place wasn't much, standard cheap rental within walls, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, and a bathroom where you had to practically sit sideways on the toilet. But it was mine, and it was clean, which was more than I could say for most places I could afford on a landfill worker's salary. I set the statue on my kitchen table and just stared at it for a while, in the better lighting of my apartment. It looked even weirder than it had at work. The proportions were all wrong. The limbs too long, the torso stretched thin, the head tiny compared to everything else. If someone had asked me to describe it, I would have said it looked like a person who'd been put on a medieval torture rack and stretched until they looked more like a scarecrow than a human being. But there was something about it that kept drawing my eye. Maybe it was the way the bronze seemed to have this warm, golden undertone beneath all the grime. Or maybe it was just a mystery of what those French words on the base actually said. Either way, I found myself thinking about it while I ate my microwave dinner and watched the evening news. The next day was Saturday, which meant I had the whole weekend to myself. I'd originally planned to just veg out, maybe catch up on some Netflix, but I kept thinking about that statue. Finally, around noon, I decided to clean it up properly. I figure if I was going to keep this thing, I might as well see what it actually looked like under all that crud. I started with warm, soapy water and an old toothbrush, gently scrubbing away layers of dirt and what looked like soot. The bronze underneath was beautiful, a rich, golden color that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through my kitchen window. As I worked, more details emerged. The figure wasn't just stretched out. It was walking 1 foot forward, arms swinging naturally. There was something almost graceful about the proportions that hadn't been obvious when it was covered in grime. The inscription on the base was becoming clearer, too. I could make out individual letters now, though I still had no idea what they meant. My high school French had consisted mostly of learning how to ask where the bathroom was and complaining about homework. So reading artistic inscriptions was way beyond my skill level. After about 3 hours of careful cleaning, the transformation was incredible. What had looked like a piece of junk that morning now looked like something that belonged in a museum. The surface had this patina that seemed to shift between gold and green, depending on how the light hit it. The figure's face, which had been completely obscured by grime, now showed delicate features that somehow managed to convey both serenity and motion at the same time. But it was the inscription that really got my attention. Now that I could read it clearly, I could see it said something like Alberto Giacometti, followed by what looked like a date from the 1960s. The name sounded familiar, like something I might have heard in an art history class back in college. But I couldn't place it. Sunday morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to public library. Our town's library wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it had decent internet access and a surprisingly good art section. I found a computer terminal and started Googling Alberto Giacometti. What I found made my heart start racing. Alberto Giacometti was apparently some famous Swiss sculptor who died in the 1960s. His sculptures were known for being exactly what I was looking at, elongated human figures that looked like they'd been stretched thin. And according to Wikipedia, his work sold for millions of dollars at auction. I tried to stay calm and rational about it. Just because I'd found something with his name on it didn't mean it was real. There had to be thousands of fake Giacomettis floating around, right? People made reproductions of famous artworks all the time. The chances that I'd stumbled across a real one in a landfill were basically zero. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about this piece. The way it was made, the quality of the bronze work, the way the patina had aged, everything about it screamed authenticity to me, even though I had no real knowledge of art or sculpture. I spent the rest of Sunday afternoon researching everything I could find about Giacometti's work. I learned that his walking figures were his most famous pieces, that he'd made several variations of them throughout the 1960s, and that they were considered masterpieces of modern sculpture. I also learned that several of his pieces had gone missing over the years, stolen from private collections, lost during estate sales, or simply disappeared into private hands where they'd been forgotten. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I had might be real. But I needed expert confirmation, and I had no idea how to go about getting it. It's not like I could just walk into a fancy art gallery with my work boots and high-vis vest and ask someone to authenticate a multi-million-dollar sculpture. Monday morning came, and I went back to work with the statue carefully wrapped in towels and hidden in my bedroom closet. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I looked at a piece of scrap metal, I found myself wondering if there might be other treasures hidden in the endless stream of garbage we processed every day. Big Mike noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay. I just told him I was working through some personal stuff. During my lunch break, I called my old college roommate Dave. He'd gone on to get his master's degree in art history and was working at a museum in Chicago. If anyone could point me in the right direction, it would be him. We hadn't talked in months, but he was always good about keeping in touch with old friends. When I explained what I'd found, Dave got really quiet for a moment. Then he started asking very specific questions about the statue's dimensions, the patina, the inscription, and where exactly I'd found it. I could tell he was taking this seriously, which both excited and terrified me. Finally, he told me I needed to get it looked at by a professional appraiser, and he gave me the name of someone in the city who specialized in modern sculpture. The problem was, this appraiser charged $500 just for an initial consultation, and that was money I definitely didn't have lying around. I was already living paycheck to paycheck, and my savings account had maybe $200 in it on a good month. But Dave convinced me it was worth taking out a small loan or putting it on a credit card if there was even a chance the piece was authentic. That night, I called the appraiser's office and made an appointment for the following Saturday. The secretary warned me that Dr. Martinez only dealt with serious collectors and established dealers, but when I mentioned Dave's name and explained the situation, she agreed to squeeze me in. I think the fact that I had potentially found a Giacometti in a landfill was too interesting for even a high-end art expert to ignore. The week dragged by slower than molasses. Every day at work felt like torture, because I knew I had this potentially life-changing thing sitting in my closet, but I couldn't do anything about it until Saturday. I found myself making mental lists of what I'd do with the money if the statue turned out to be real. Pay off my student loans, obviously. Maybe buy a decent car to replace my beat-up Honda Civic, get a nicer apartment, or hell, maybe even put a down payment on a house. But mostly, I thought about my family's reaction. I imagined walking into one of those Monday dinners and casually mentioning that I just made more money from one piece of garbage than Jake made in 5 years of selling overpriced houses. I pictured the look on Dad's face when he realized that his failure of a son had stumbled onto something that would set him up for life. The fantasy was so sweet, it almost made the waiting bearable. Friday night, I barely slept. I must have gotten up a dozen times to check on the statue, making sure it was still there, that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I rewrapped it carefully in clean towels and put it in a sturdy cardboard box for the trip to the city. I'd borrowed my coworker Tony's pickup truck for the day, since my Honda definitely wasn't reliable enough for a 2-hour drive with precious cargo. Saturday morning, I was on the road by 7 a.m., giving myself plenty of time to get to Dr. Martinez's office by my 10 o'clock appointment. The drive gave me time to think, and for the first time since I'd found the statue, I started having serious doubts. What if this was all just wishful thinking? What if I was about to pay $500? I couldn't afford to have some expert tell me I'd found a worthless reproduction. But as I pulled into the parking lot of the upscale art district where Dr. Martinez had her office, I realized it didn't matter. Even if the statue turned out to be fake, at least I'd know for sure. And if it was real, well, my entire life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. Dr. Carmen Martinez's office was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of some stuffy museum-style space with velvet ropes and pretentious artwork, it looked more like a cross between a laboratory and a high-end doctor's office. Clean white walls, professional lighting, and equipment I couldn't even begin to identify. The woman herself was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and a kind of intense focus that made you feel like she could see right through you. She didn't seem particularly impressed by my work clothes or nervous demeanor, but her whole attitude changed the moment I carefully unwrapped the statue and placed it on her examination table. I watched her face go through a series of expressions. Curiosity, then surprise, then something that looked almost like hunger. For the next hour, Dr. Martinez put my statue through what I can only describe as the most thorough physical examination I'd ever witnessed. She measured every dimension, photographed it from dozens of angles, and used various tools to examine the patina and surface texture. She even took tiny scrapings from the base for what she called metallurgical analysis. The whole time, she barely spoke, just made notes on a tablet, and occasionally muttered things in Spanish that I couldn't understand. Finally, she sat back and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. She asked me again exactly where I'd found it, how it had been stored, and whether I'd done anything to it besides cleaning. I answered honestly, explaining about the estate sale items and how I'd cleaned it with soap and water. She nodded thoughtfully and made more notes. Then came the moment of truth. Dr. Martinez pulled up some files on her computer and showed me several images of similar sculptures. She explained that Giacometti had created a series of walking figures in the early 1960s, and that several of them had been sold to private collectors. One particular piece, she said, had been missing from a private collection in Connecticut since the late 1960s. The collector had died, his estate had been liquidated hastily, and this particular sculpture had simply vanished. The measurements, the patina, the inscription, and even some small details I had noticed all matched the missing piece exactly. Based on her preliminary examination, Dr. Martinez was 90% certain that what I'd found was not only genuine, but specifically the missing sculpture from the Connecticut estate. She wanted to do more extensive testing to be absolutely sure, but everything pointed to authenticity. When I asked about value, she got quiet for a moment. Then she pulled up some auction records on her computer. A similar Giacometti walking figure had sold at Sotheby's 2 years earlier for $38 million. Another had gone for $45 million just 6 months ago. The missing piece I'd found, she explained, would likely bring anywhere from $30 to $70 million at auction, depending on market conditions and bidding competition. I honestly thought I was going to pass out. $70 million. I'd gone from worrying about a $500 appraisal fee to potentially having more money than some small countries. My hands were actually shaking as I tried to process what she was telling me. But Dr. Martinez wasn't done. She explained that proving authenticity would require additional testing that would cost several $1,000s. There would also be legal complications. We need to establish clear ownership, research the provenance, and potentially deal with insurance companies or heirs of the original collector. The whole process could take months and would require lawyers more experts and significant upfront costs. She also warned me about something I hadn't considered: publicity. Once word got out about the discovery, it would be news. Art world scandals and discoveries like this made headlines, especially when they involved ordinary people finding treasures in unexpected places. My life would change whether I wanted it to or not. As I drove home that afternoon, my head was spinning with possibilities and problems I'd never imagined. Dr. Martinez had agreed to begin the authentication process and had given me the names of several lawyers who specialize in art recovery cases. But she'd also made it clear that this was just the beginning of what would likely be a long, complex journey. The first thing I did when I got home was call Dave and update him on everything. He was almost as excited as I was, but he also helped me think through the practical implications. We talked about the need for insurance, secure storage, and keeping the discovery quiet until all the legal issues were sorted out. The last thing I wanted was to have someone challenge my ownership or try to steal the sculpture before I could establish my rights to it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The statue was locked in a safe deposit box at the bank downtown. The first major expense in what Dr. Martinez had warned would be a costly process. But even with it safely stored, I couldn't stop my mind from racing through all the implications of what I'd stumbled into. The money was obviously life-changing, but it was more than that. For the first time since I'd started working at the landfill, I felt like I had something to prove to my family. Not just that I wasn't a failure, but that their whole way of measuring success was wrong. Jake might have his fancy car and his real estate commissions, but I just discovered something worth more than he'd make in several lifetimes. Monday morning at work was torture. I went through the motions of my job, but my heart wasn't in it. Every piece of scrap metal I handled made me wonder what other treasures might be hiding in plain sight. Big Mike noticed I was distracted and finally cornered me during lunch break. Wanted to know what was going on. I just told him I was dealing with some family stuff and promised to get my head back in the game. The problem was keeping quiet about the discovery. Dr. Martinez had been very clear about the need for discretion during the authentication process, but I was practically bursting with the secret. A couple of times, I almost slipped and said something to my co-workers, but I managed to catch myself each time. The real test came that evening when Jake called me. This was unusual. My brother rarely contacted me unless he needed something or wanted to gloat about some new success. But apparently Mom had mentioned that I seemed different lately, and he was calling to check if everything was okay. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family had suddenly started paying attention to me just as I was sitting on the biggest secret of my life. I managed to deflect his questions without revealing anything, but it was hard. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, just to see his reaction. But I knew that would be a mistake. Once my family knew, everyone would know, and Dr. Martinez had been very clear about the importance of controlling the narrative around the discovery. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a strange routine. During the day, I worked at the landfill, going through motions but constantly distracted by thoughts of authentication tests and legal proceedings. In the evenings, I'd call or email with various experts Dr. Martinez had connected me with: lawyers, insurance specialists, and other art authentication professionals. The costs were mounting quickly. Legal fees, additional testing, insurance of sculpture, and secure storage were eating through my savings faster than I'd expected. I'd already maxed out one credit card and was considering taking out a personal loan to cover the remaining expenses. Dr. Martinez assured me that these were necessary investments that would be recovered many times over if the authentication was successful, but it was still nerve-wracking to spend money I didn't have on something that was still technically unproven. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after my initial visit to Dr. Martinez. She called me on a Thursday evening with news that the final metallurgical tests had confirmed what she'd suspected from the beginning. The bronze composition, the aging patterns, and even microscopic tool marks all matched known examples of Giacometti's work from the same period. Combined with the provenance research that had traced the sculpture's disappearance from the Connecticut estate, there was no doubt about authenticity. I was officially the owner of a genuine Alberto Giacometti sculpture, worth somewhere between $40 and $80 million. The exact value would depend on market conditions when I decided to sell, but even conservative estimates were beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, looking around at my secondhand furniture and wondering how long it would be before my life caught up with my bank account. Dr. Martinez had already put me in touch with representatives from several major auction houses, and initial estimates suggested the piece could go to market within 6 months if I wanted to move quickly. But first, there was something I needed to do. Something I had been planning since that first moment in Dr. Martinez's office when she confirmed my wildest hopes. It was time to have a conversation with my family, and this time I wouldn't be the one feeling ashamed about my job. Just when I thought things were finally going my way, the universe decided to throw me the biggest curveball of my life. It was a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after Dr. Martinez had confirmed the authenticity of the sculpture, when I got called into the main office at work. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes management needed to discuss schedule changes or safety updates with the crew. But something about the way Big Mike looked at me when he delivered the message made my stomach drop. The landfill's main office was in a double-wide trailer that served as headquarters for the entire operation. I'd only been inside a handful of times in my 3 years of working there, usually for paperwork or the occasional safety meeting. But this time felt different. There were 2 guys in expensive suits sitting across from Mr. Peterson, the site manager, and they all looked like they meant business. Mr. Peterson introduced the suits as corporate lawyers from the company that owned our landfill. Apparently, word had somehow leaked about my discovery, and they'd done some research of their own. They'd found out about the authentication process, the potential value of the sculpture, and most importantly, they reviewed the employee handbook regarding items found on company property. The lead lawyer, a thin guy with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd never done a day of manual labor in his life, started laying out their position. According to Section 12 of the employee agreement I'd signed when I started working there, any items recovered from the landfill property became the property of the company. It didn't matter if the items were in designated scrap areas or general waste. If it was on their land, it belonged to them. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. 3 years of working this job, dealing with my family's constant criticism, and finally finding something that could change my life completely, only to have some corporate lawyers try to take it away from me. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I told them I needed time to review the situation with my own attorney, and that I wouldn't be making any decisions without legal representation. The thin lawyer smiled the kind of smile that made you want to punch him in the face. He explained that they'd already filed paperwork with the court requesting an injunction to prevent me from selling or transferring ownership of the sculpture while the matter was resolved. They were also considering criminal charges for theft of company property, depending on how cooperative I was willing to be. Walking out of that trailer, I felt like my world was collapsing. I'd gone from being on top of the world to potentially facing criminal charges in the span of 20 minutes. The worst part was that I could see some of my co-workers watching me from across the yard, probably wondering why I'd been called in and what kind of trouble I might be in. I called the lawyer Dr. Martinez had recommended, a guy named Robert Chun, who specialized in art law and property disputes. His office was in the city, about an hour's drive from the landfill, but he agreed to see me that afternoon. I told Big Mike I was having a family emergency and needed to leave early, which wasn't exactly a lie. This felt like the biggest emergency of my life. Robert Chin was nothing like the corporate lawyers I just dealt with. He was probably in his 40s, with a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. His office was filled with art books and legal journals, and he had several sculptures displayed on shelves around the room. When I explained the situation, he listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about the discovery, the authentication process, and the exact circumstances of how I'd found the sculpture. After reviewing the employee handbook and the company's claims, Chin gave me both good news and bad news. The bad news was that the company had a legitimate legal argument based on the employee agreement. The good news was that there were several potential defenses we could use, particularly regarding the specific location where I found the sculpture and the company's own policies about scrap metal recovery. Chin explained that the key issue was something called abandonment doctrine. If the company had effectively abandoned the items by placing them in areas designated for disposal or scrap recovery, and if employees were permitted or encouraged to remove items from those areas, then the company's ownership claims became much weaker. He'd seen similar cases involving construction workers who'd found valuable items in demolition debris, and the outcomes varied widely depending on the specific circumstances. The legal battle would be expensive and could take months or even years to resolve. Chin estimated that fighting the case properly would cost at least $50,000 in legal fees, and possibly much more if it went to trial. But he also pointed out that with tens of millions of dollars at stake, it was worth fighting for. He agreed to take the case on a contingency basis, meaning he'd only get paid if we won, but his percentage would be significant. That night, I barely slept. I kept going over every detail of how I'd found the sculpture, tried to remember exactly where it had been and what the company's policies were about scrap metal recovery. I'd always been told that metal sorting was part of my job, and that we were allowed to take small amounts of scrap for personal use as long as it didn't interfere with operations. But had anyone ever specifically said that applied to valuable items? The next few days at work were incredibly awkward. Word had gotten around that I was involved in some kind of legal dispute with the company, and my co-workers didn't know what to make of it. Some guys were supportive, figuring that if I'd found something valuable, I deserved to keep it. Others thought I was stupid for fighting the company and risking my job over what they assumed was probably just some expensive junk. Big Mike pulled me aside on Friday and gave me some advice that stuck with me. He'd been working in industrial jobs for over 20 years, and he'd seen plenty of workers get screwed over by companies when money was involved. He told me that if I really had found something valuable, I shouldn't let them intimidate me into giving up without a fight. But he also warned me that going up against corporate lawyers was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. I needed to be prepared for them to play dirty. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the sculpture remained in secure storage, and I was prohibited from discussing the sale with any auction houses or potential buyers. The injunction had effectively frozen everything while the legal battle played out. Chun assured me this was normal in cases like this, but it was frustrating to be so close to life-changing money and not be able to do anything about it. The discovery had leaked to local media by this point, and I found myself dealing with reporters who wanted to interview the garbage man who struck it rich. I followed Chen's advice and declined all interviews, but the attention was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, art dealers, and people claiming to be long-lost relatives who wanted to reconnect. The worst part was my family's reaction. When they found out about the sculpture and the legal battle, their response was typically disappointing. Instead of being supportive or excited about the possibility of me making life-changing money, they seemed more concerned about the negative attention it might bring to the family name. Dad actually suggested I should just settle with the company and take whatever they offered, rather than risk losing everything in a legal battle. But I was done letting other people make decisions about my life. For 3 years, I'd listened to their criticism and accepted their judgment about my choices. Now I had a chance to prove that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards, and I wasn't going to let fear or family pressure stop me from fighting for what was rightfully mine. The company's lawyers kept increasing the pressure, filing additional motions, and even suggesting they might terminate my employment for creating a disruptive work environment. But Chen had warned me this was all psychological warfare, designed to make me fold before we even got to court. The real battle was just beginning, and I was determined to see it through to the end. As the hearing date approached, I spent my evenings going through boxes of employment documents, work schedules, and company memos that Chen had requested. We were building a case that the company had not only permitted but encouraged metal recovery by employees, and that the area where I had found the sculpture was clearly designated as abandoned property. It was tedious work, but every piece of evidence brought us closer to proving that the sculpture was legally mine. The night before the hearing, I sat in my apartment looking at photos of the sculpture that Dr. Martinez had taken during the authentication process. Tomorrow would determine whether I'd spend the rest of my life working at the landfill or whether I'd have the financial freedom to do whatever I wanted with my future. Either way, I knew I'd never be the same person who let his family make him feel worthless for earning an honest living. The courthouse was nothing like the TV courtrooms I'd grown up watching. It was smaller, more sterile, and filled with the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. I'd worn my only decent suit, the same one I bought for job interviews 3 years earlier, and I felt completely out of place among all the lawyers in their expensive tailored clothes. Chun met me in the hallway outside the courtroom and went over our strategy one more time. We had witness statements from 3 of my co-workers confirming that metal recovery was not only allowed, but encouraged by management. We had documentation showing that the area where I'd found the sculpture was designated as general disposal rather than company property. Most importantly, we had security camera footage that Chun had subpoenaed showing me finding the sculpture in an area where employees routinely removed scrap metal. The company's legal team looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate law firm commercial. 3 lawyers in identical dark suits, all carrying expensive briefcases, and looking like they'd never lost a case in their lives. The lead lawyer was the same thin guy with wire-rimmed glasses who'd ambushed me in the trailer, and he had the same annoying smile that made you want to wipe it off his face. Judge Morrison was a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd seen every kind of legal dispute imaginable. She listened patiently as both sides presented their opening arguments, occasionally asking pointed questions that showed she understood the complexities of the case better than I'd expected. When the company's lawyer started talking about employee theft and breach of contract, she actually rolled her eyes slightly, which I took as a good sign. The first day of hearings focused on establishing the basic facts of case. Chun had me testify about how I found the sculpture, what my understanding of company policy was regarding scrap metal, and how the discovery and authentication process had unfolded. The company's lawyer tried to make me look like I'd deliberately stolen valuable property, but Chun had prepared me well for the cross-examination. The key moment came when they played the security camera footage. You could clearly see me working in an area where other employees routinely removed scrap metal, following the same procedures I'd used hundreds of times before. When I found the sculpture, I'd set it aside with other metal items, just like I always did. There was nothing sneaky or deceptive about my actions. I was just doing my job the way I'd been trained to do it. Big Mike testified on my behalf the second day, and his testimony was crucial. He explained that metal recovery was part of our regular duties, that employees were encouraged to separate valuable scrap from general waste, and that the company had never objected to workers taking small amounts of scrap metal for personal use. When the company's lawyer tried to argue that this policy didn't apply to valuable items, Big Mike pointed out that nobody could have known the sculpture was valuable just by looking at it covered in grime. The company's witnesses were less convincing. The site manager, Mr. Peterson, seemed nervous and kept contradicting himself when she cross-examined him. The corporate executives who testified had clearly never set foot on the actual landfill and had no real understanding of how day-to-day operations worked. Their testimony felt rehearsed and out of touch with reality. Chen's closing argument was brilliant. He painted a picture of a hard-working employee who'd followed company procedures exactly as he'd been trained, only to have the company try to steal his discovery after the fact when they realized how valuable it was. He argued that the sculpture had been legally abandoned when it was placed in the disposal area, and that my recovery of it was not only permitted, but encouraged by company policy. The company's lawyer tried to argue that valuable items were inherently different from regular scrap metal, and that the company had never intended to abandon anything worth millions of dollars. But Chun countered by pointing out that the company had no way of knowing the sculpture was valuable, and that their own policies made no distinction between valuable and worthless items in disposal areas. Judge Morrison took 2 weeks to issue her ruling, and those were the longest 2 weeks of my life. I continued working at the landfill, but the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Management clearly expected to win the case, and was treating me like a criminal who'd temporarily gotten away with theft. My co-workers were divided between those who supported me and those who thought I was crazy for fighting the company. When the ruling came down, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. Judge Morrison not only ruled that the sculpture was legally mine, but she also criticized the company for what she called opportunistic litigation designed to intimidate an employee who'd follow proper procedures. She noted that the company had failed to prove any intentional wrongdoing on my part, and that their own policy supported my right to recover abandoned items. The celebration was short-lived, though. The company immediately announced they would appeal the decision, which meant more legal battles and more delays before I could actually sell the sculpture. Chin warned me that appeals could take years to resolve, and that the company would probably try to drag things out as long as possible in hopes that I'd eventually run out of money for legal fees. But something unexpected happened while we were preparing for the appeal. A reporter from the New York Times had been following the story, and when Judge Morrison's ruling came down, it made national news. The story of the garbage man who'd found a $70 million sculpture and had to fight his own company to keep it struck a nerve with people across the country. I started getting letters of support from strangers, and several legal advocacy groups offered to help with the appeal process. More importantly, the publicity caught the attention of other art collectors and legal experts who dealt with similar cases. 3 different law firms offered to take over my case pro bono, seeing it as a precedent-setting opportunity that could benefit other workers in similar situations. The negative publicity was also putting pressure on the landfill company, whose corporate image was taking a beating from the perception that they were trying to steal from their own employees. 6 months after the initial ruling, the company's lawyers approached Chun about settling the case. They were facing mounting legal costs, bad publicity, and pressure from their own board directors to resolve the situation. Their initial settlement offer was insulting. They wanted to split the proceeds 50-50, keeping half of my discovery for themselves. Chun laughed and told them to call back when they were ready to make a serious offer. The breakthrough came when I received an unexpected phone call from the CEO of the waste management company that owned the landfill. He'd apparently been following the case closely and was concerned about the damage it was doing to the company's reputation. He offered to settle for a 10% finder's fee, meaning I'd keep 90% of whatever the sculpture sold for. In exchange, the company would drop all appeals and legal challenges, and I'd agree not to pursue any countersuits for legal costs or damages. Chin advised me to take the deal. Fighting the appeal could take years and cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, with no guarantee of success. The 10% fee was reasonable compensation for the company's role in preserving the sculpture until I found it, and it would allow me to move forward with selling the piece immediately. After 3 years of working in their landfill and months of legal battles, I was ready to be done with the whole situation. The auction took place at Sotheby's in London 6 months later. The sculpture, officially titled Walking Man 3, sold for $94 million, the highest price ever paid for a Giacometti at auction. After taxes, legal fees, and the company's 10% finder's fee, I walked away with just over $60 million. $60 million. The first thing I did was buy a house, not some massive mansion, but a nice place in a good neighborhood where I could have some peace and quiet. Then I paid off every debt I'd ever accumulated, including my parents' mortgage and Jake's student loans. I didn't tell them where the money came from. I just had lawyers handle it anonymously. The Monday dinner where I finally told my family the whole story was everything I'd imagined and more. I showed up in my old work clothes, carrying a folder full of newspaper clippings and auction documents. When I laid it all out on the table, the discovery, the legal battle, the sale price, the silence was deafening. Dad just stared at the papers for the longest time. Finally, he looked up at me and said, "You mean to tell me that while we were giving you grief about working at the dump, you found something worth more than all of us will make in our entire lives?" I nodded and took a sip of my beer. Funny how things work out sometimes. Jake was the first to really react. He started laughing, not mean laughter, but the kind of amazed laughter you get when reality completely blindsides you. "Jesus Christ," he said, "I've been bragging about my commission checks while my brother was literally finding buried treasure." But the conversation that meant the most to me happened later, when Mom pulled me aside in the kitchen. She apologized for all the years of making me feel like a failure, for not understanding that there's dignity in any honest work. She said she was proud of me, not for finding the sculpture, but for sticking to my principles and fighting for what was rightfully mine. I still work sometimes, not because I need the money, but because I like staying busy. I bought a small art gallery in town and help other people who think they might have found something valuable. You'd be amazed how much good stuff gets thrown away by people who don't know what they have. The landfill job taught me something my business degree never could. That treasure can be found in the places other people think are worthless. Sometimes the biggest discoveries come from paying attention to what everyone else ignores. And sometimes the people who look down on you for doing honest work are just scared that you might find something they missed. I kept one thing from my old life, my work boots. They're sitting in my closet right now, caked with 3 years' worth of landfill mud and memories. Every once in a while, when I'm feeling too comfortable or too disconnected from where I came from, I take them out and remember what it felt like to be the family failure who turned out to be the only one who knew how to recognize real treasure when he saw it.